Silverbow County, Montana Territory, September 1891. The rain fell sideways across the cemetery, driven by a wind that seemed determined to punish anyone foolish enough to stand outside. Callum Tierney stood at the edge of the freshly dug grave, his right hand gripping his sister's small fingers so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Maeve pressed against his side, her 8-year-old body shaking with sobs she could not control. The pine coffin sat at the bottom of the hole, already collecting puddles of brown water. Inside that box lay their father, Declan Tierney, the finest blacksmith in Silverbow County. The man who had taught Callum everything he knew about iron and fire, and the secret language that metal speaks to those patient enough to listen. 3 days ago, Declan had been alive. 3 days ago, he had been working at the forge, shaping a set of hinges for the new church doors. 3 days ago, Callum had watched his father wipe sweat from his brow and smile at him across the glowing coals. Then the accident happened. A support beam in the forge ceiling had given way without warning. Declan pushed Callum out of the path of the falling timber, but he could not save himself. The beam struck him across the back of the head, and he never woke again. He died in Callum's arms before the doctor could even be summoned. Now Callum stood in the rain, 14 years old, responsible for his 8-year-old sister, with winter approaching and no parents left in the world. Their mother had died giving birth to Maeve. Now their father was gone too. 2 children alone against the Montana wilderness. Why, Reverend Josiah Crane spoke words that the wind tore away before they could reach the small crowd of mourners. Callum did not need to hear them. He knew what the Reverend was saying. Dust to dust, ashes to ashes, the same words spoken over every grave in this hard country. The crowd was small. A blacksmith commanded respect, but rarely inspired deep friendship. The people of Silverbow County had come out of obligation, not affection. They stood in their dark clothes, heads bowed against the rain, already thinking about the warm fires waiting in their own homes. Callum watched them, and he understood something that made his stomach clench with fear. Not one of them was thinking about what would happen to him and Maeve. When the final prayer ended, the mourners began to drift away. They offered brief condolences. He touched Callum's shoulder with gloved hands, told him that his father was a good man. None of them offered to take the children in. None of them asked how 2 young orphans would survive the coming winter. One man did not drift away. Silas Hargrove stood apart from the other mourners, his black coat untouched by the rain thanks to the massive umbrella his wife Dorothia held above his head. Silas was the largest landowner in the county, a man who had built his fortune on cattle and copper mining investments. His ranch bordered the Tierney property on 3 sides. For years, Silas had wanted that property. The Tierney land held the only natural spring for miles, a source of fresh water that never froze even in the deepest winter. With that spring, Silas could expand his cattle operation by hundreds of head. Without it, his growth was limited. Declan Tierney had refused every offer Silas made. The land had belonged to Declan's father before him, and his grandfather before that. The Tierneys had come from Ireland with nothing and built something on this hard Montana soil. Declan would sooner have cut off his own hand than sell that land. But Declan was dead now, and his children were alone. Silas approached the grave as the last mourners departed. His boots squelched in the mud, but his face showed no discomfort. He looked down at Callum with an expression that might have been sympathy if you did not know Silas Hargrove. "A terrible loss," Silas said. His voice was deep and smooth, like oil poured over stone. "Your father was a skilled man. The county will miss him." Callum said nothing. Maeve pressed harder against his side. "I imagine you're wondering what comes next," Silas continued. 2 children alone, winter coming on fast. No family to speak of, no one to provide for you. "We will manage," Callum said. His voice came out stronger than he expected. Silas smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Will you now?" He glanced around the empty cemetery, then back at Callum. "Boy, I have lived in Montana for 30 years. I have seen what winter does to grown men with full larders and plenty of firewood. You are 14 years old. Your sister is 8. You have no mother, no father, no family within 1,000 miles. You have a cabin that needs repairs, a forge you are too young to operate safely, and maybe 3 months of supplies if you are lucky." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I am prepared to make you a fair offer. I will buy your father's land. The cabin, the forge, everything. I will pay you enough to travel east, find relatives, start fresh somewhere. You will not have to watch your sister freeze to death come January. Callum felt Maeve's grip tighten on his hand. How much, or he asked. Silas named a figure. It was perhaps 1/10 of what the land was actually worth. That is robbery, Callum said quietly. Silas shrugged. That is reality. In 3 months, you will be dead or desperate. Either way, I will end up with that land. I am offering you a chance to walk away with something instead of nothing. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. I have the papers right here. Sign them, and you can leave before the first snow falls. Stay, and he shook his head slowly. Well, nature has a way of solving these problems. Callum looked at the paper in Silas's hand. He thought about the cabin where he and Maeve had been born, the forge where his father had taught him to shape iron, the grave they were standing beside, where his father's body lay in the cold ground. No, he said. Silas blinked. No? This land belonged to my grandfather. It belonged to my father. It belongs to me now. I am not selling it to you for any price. Silas stared at him for a long moment. Then he laughed, a short, harsh sound that held no humor. Pride, he said, the same stubborn Irish pride that kept your father poor his whole life. Fine, keep your land, keep your pride. But remember this conversation in January, boy, when you are burning furniture to stay warm and your sister is crying from hunger. He turned and walked away, his wife hurrying to keep the umbrella above his head. Callum watched him go. Then he looked down at Maeve, whose face was streaked with tears and rain. Are we going to die? She whispered. Callum knelt in the mud beside his sister. He took both her hands in his and looked directly into her eyes. No, he said, we are not going to die. Father taught me things that can save us. Do you trust me? Maeve nodded slowly. Then we are going to be fine. I promise. He did not know yet if he could keep that promise, but he knew he would die trying. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road that turned to mud when it rained and to frozen ruts when it did not. It was small but solidly built, with log walls chinked with clay and a stone fireplace that dominated the north wall. Callum's grandfather had constructed it 40 years ago. Yes, and Callum's father had maintained it carefully ever since. Now it was Callum's responsibility. They returned from the cemetery soaked to the bone. Callum built up the fire while Maeve changed into dry clothes, and soon the main room was warm enough that steam rose from their wet things hung near the hearth. Their cow Bess lowed from the small barn attached to the cabin. She was a gentle creature, brown and white, with patient eyes that seemed to understand more than any animal should. Their father had bought her 2 years ago, and she had become essential to their survival. Fresh milk every day, butter when they had time to churn it, a source of warmth and comfort in the long winter months. Maeve loved Bess more than anything except her brother. She talked to the cow constantly, sharing secrets and fears that she would not voice to anyone else. Bess would low softly in response, as if offering comfort. Tonight, Maeve sat on the floor with a cup of warm milk, watching her brother move around the cabin with a purpose she did not understand. Callum was searching for something, pulling boxes from shelves, checking drawers, looking under furniture. What are you looking for? She asked. Something Father showed me once, Callum replied. A box. Iron. About this big. He held his hands apart. He kept it hidden somewhere. Why? Because what is inside is valuable. More valuable than money. He searched for another hour before he found it. The box was wedged into a gap beneath the floorboards near their parents' bed, hidden so well that Callum had walked over it 1,000 times without knowing. He pried up the loose board and pulled the box free. It was exactly as he remembered. A small iron chest blackened by age with a simple latch that required no key. Callum carried it to the table and set it down carefully. Maeve came to stand beside him, her eyes wide with curiosity. Callum opened the lid. Inside were papers, dozens of pages covered in their father's careful handwriting, accompanied by detailed drawings that showed measurements, angles, and construction techniques. Callum lifted the first page and began to read. His hands started to shake. What is it? Maeve asked. Callum could not answer immediately. He was reading his father's words written years ago, describing a vision that seemed impossible. A floor made of iron, a fire chamber sealed beneath the cabin, a system that would heat the entire living space with a fraction of the wood required by a traditional fireplace. His father had worked out every detail: the thickness of the iron plates, the dimensions of the fire chamber, the ventilation system that would carry smoke away from the house while letting heat rise into the living space. Everything was there, waiting to be built. Father was planning this for years, Callum said finally. He figured out how to keep us warm through winter. Really warm, not just surviving. He never had time to build it. What is it? Maeve repeated. Callum looked at his sister. He thought about Silas Hargrove's words, about nature solving problems, about 2 children freezing in January. It is how we are going to live, he said. Father left us a gift. The best gift he could have given us. He spread the papers across the table, studying the designs. Iron conducted heat far better than wood or stone. A floor made of iron plates, heated from below by a sealed fire chamber, would distribute warmth evenly across the entire room. No more huddling near the fireplace while the rest of the cabin froze. No more cold floors that sucked heat from every step. No more children shivering in their beds because the fire had died down overnight. The floor itself would become the heat source. But building it would require everything Callum knew about blacksmithing. He would have to forge 12 iron plates, each one perfectly flat and free of cracks. He would have to excavate a fire chamber beneath the cabin, line it with stone, create a ventilation system that worked flawlessly. And he would have to do it all before winter arrived in earnest. And he would have to do it alone. Can you really build this? Maeve asked, looking at the drawings. Father taught me, Callum said. He showed me everything about working iron. He made me practice until I could do it in my sleep. He paused. It will be hard, harder than anything I have ever done. But yes, I can build this. Then we will not die? Callum pulled his sister into a hug. We will not die. We are going to be warmer than anyone in Silverbow County. Father made sure of it. That night, Callum lay awake in his bed, listening to the wind howl outside and the fire crackle in the hearth. He thought about everything that needed to be done: the excavation, the stonework, the forging, weeks of backbreaking labor with no guarantee of success. He thought about Silas Hargrove, waiting for them to fail. He thought about his father, lying in the cold ground, trusting his son to carry on. And he made a decision. Tomorrow he would begin. If you were Callum, 14 years old, facing a Montana winter with only your little sister and a cow named Bess, what would you do? Drop a comment below and tell us. And if you have not already, hit that subscribe button. You are going to want to see what happens next. Word spread through Silverbow County within days. The Tierney boy was planning something insane. He was going to dig up his cabin floor and replace it with iron. Iron plates, forged by a 14-year-old, heated by a fire burning under the house. The whole scheme sounded like a recipe for disaster. Where the gossip reached Silas Hargrove at his ranch on the 3rd day after the funeral. The boy is doing what? Silas asked, setting down his coffee cup. His foreman, a weathered man named Crane, shifted uncomfortably. Digging a pit under the cabin, sir. Says he is going to install some kind of iron floor heated from below. Claims his father designed it. Silas stared at the man for a long moment. Then he began to laugh. An iron floor, he said. In Montana winter. Does the boy have any idea what iron does at 40 below? It sucks heat right out of anything that touches it. He is going to freeze his sister solid on that floor. That is what folks are saying, sir. Silas leaned back in his chair, still smiling. Let him dig. Let him waste his time and energy on this foolishness. By November, he will realize his mistake. By December, he will be begging to sell. By January, he shrugged. Well, either way, I will have that land before spring. He picked up his coffee cup again, deeply satisfied. The boy was doing his work for him. On a cold October morning, Silas Hargrove rode out to the Tierney property to see the madness for himself. What he found was a 14-year-old boy standing waist-deep in a pit, shoveling dirt with mechanical determination. The boy's hands were wrapped in cloth bandages, stained brown with blood. His face was pale with exhaustion, but he kept digging, one shovelful at a time, as if he could not hear the wind telling him to stop. Silas dismounted and walked to the edge of the pit. "Morning, boy." Callum looked up. His eyes held no fear, no warmth, no recognition of who Silas was or what he wanted. They held only stubborn determination. "Mr. A. Hargrove, I heard about your project, came to see it for myself." Silas looked around at the growing pile of dirt, the exposed roots, the hole that seemed entirely too small to accomplish anything useful. "Iron floor, is it?" "Yes, sir." "You know what iron does in winter?" "Yes, sir. It conducts heat." Silas laughed. "It conducts cold, boy. Put your bare hand on iron at 20 below, and you will leave skin behind. Your father should have taught you that." Callum's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "My father taught me that cold iron steals heat. He also taught me that warm iron shares it. The difference is where the fire is." "Riddles." Silas shook his head. "You are going to kill yourself and your sister with riddles and fairy tales about warm iron." He paused, watching the boy's face. "The offer still stands. Sell now, before you waste another month on this foolishness. I will even raise my price by 10%. "No? Stubborn?" Silas sighed. "Just like your father, and look where that got him." He saw the flash of rage in the boy's eyes, saw the grip tighten on the shovel handle. For a moment he thought the boy might actually swing at him, but Callum Tierney controlled himself with visible effort. "Is there anything else, Mr. Hargrove?" Silas mounted his horse. He looked down at the boy in the pit, at the pathetic beginning of what was clearly a doomed project. "I will be back in December," he said. "We can discuss the sale then, assuming you are still alive." He rode away, leaving Callum alone with his shovel and his impossible dream. That evening, Silas gathered his ranch hands in the main house for dinner. Over roast beef and potatoes, he told them what he had seen at the Tierney property: the boy in the pit, the bleeding hands, the mad plan to forge an iron floor. "The fool thinks iron will keep him warm," Silas concluded. "He is going to freeze on that floor like meat in an ice house." The hands laughed, shaking their heads at the foolishness of youth. But one person at the table did not laugh. Dorothia Hargrove, Silas's wife of 23 years, sat silently through the conversation. She thought about the boy in the pit, digging alone, his hands wrapped in bloody bandages. She thought about the little girl she had seen at the funeral, clinging to her brother's hand like he was the only solid thing left in the world. She thought about her own mother, orphaned at 9, left to survive on the streets of Boston until a kind family took her in. That night, after Silas had fallen asleep, Dorothea lay awake in the darkness. She made a decision that would have consequences she could not imagine. Callum woke before dawn every morning and worked until he could no longer see by the fading light. The excavation took 3 weeks, far longer than he had hoped. The Montana soil was rocky and stubborn, fighting him with every shovelful. His hands blistered, bled, healed, and blistered again. His back ached constantly. His shoulders burned with a pain that never quite went away. But the pit grew deeper. Maeve did everything she could to help. She brought him water and food. She led Bess to pasture each morning and brought her back each evening. She learned to milk Bess properly, filling a bucket with fresh, warm milk that became their primary source of nourishment. She gathered eggs from the chickens. They fed the fire in the cabin, kept the living space clean and ready for when her brother finally came inside. She also talked to Bess constantly. The cow was her confidant, her friend, her source of comfort in a world that had taken everything else. Maeve would sit in the small barn, her cheek pressed against Bess's warm flank, and pour out her fears. "Callum works so hard," she would whisper. "His hands bleed every day. He does not eat enough. He says we will be warm, but what if he is wrong? What if Mr. Hargrove is right and we freeze on that iron floor?" Bess would low softly, as if offering comfort. "I miss Father," Maeve continued. "I miss Mother, even though I never knew her. I am scared, Bess. I am so scared." The cow would turn her head and nuzzle Maeve's hair, and that simple gesture made everything feel slightly less hopeless. On the first day of November, something happened that Callum did not expect. He was working in the pit, laying the first course of stones for the fire chamber walls, when he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up, expecting to see Silas Hargrove come to mock him again. Instead, he saw Dorothea Hargrove standing at the edge of the excavation, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. Callum climbed out of the pit, confused and wary. "Mrs. Hargrove, Mr. Tierney." She held out the basket. "I brought food, bread, cheese, some preserved meat. It is not much, but I thought you and your sister might need it." Callum did not take the basket immediately. He looked at this woman, wife of the man who wanted to take everything from them, went and tried to understand what she wanted. "Why?" he asked. Dorothia's expression shifted, showing something that might have been shame. "My mother was an orphan," she said quietly. "She was 9 years old when her parents died of cholera. She spent 2 years on the streets before someone showed her kindness. She used to tell me that kindness is the only thing that separates us from animals." She paused. "My husband has his plans for your land, but I have my own conscience, and I cannot watch 2 children struggle alone without offering what help I can." Callum studied her face for a long moment. He saw no deception there, only genuine concern. "Thank you," he said finally, taking the basket. "There is something else." Dorothea looked around nervously, as if afraid of being seen. "My husband is not a patient man. He expected you to fail quickly. The longer you persist, the more frustrated he becomes. Be careful, Callum. Silas does not like to be thwarted." "What do you mean?" But Dorothea was already retreating, hurrying back toward the road where her horse waited. "Just be careful," she called over her shoulder, "and do not trust the darkness." Callum watched her ride away, her warning echoing in his mind. Dorothea risked everything to help 2 orphans she barely knew. Have you ever received unexpected kindness from a stranger? Share your story in the comments, and make sure you have subscribed, because what happens next will break your heart. 3 nights later, Callum discovered what Dorothea's warning meant. He woke to the sound of splashing water. At first, in his half-sleeping confusion, he thought it was raining, but the sound was wrong. Too concentrated, too deliberate. He pulled on his boots and grabbed a lantern. What he found outside made him fall to his knees. Someone had flooded his fire chamber. Hundreds of gallons of water filled the pit he had spent weeks excavating. The carefully laid stones of the chamber walls were submerged. The wooden shoring he had installed to prevent cave-ins was already warping from the moisture. Weeks of work, destroyed in a single night. Callum knelt at the edge of the pit, lantern held high, staring at the disaster below. He saw boot prints in the mud, leading toward the road. Large boots made by a man's feet. He knew who had done this. He had no proof, nothing he could take to a sheriff, but he knew. Silas Hargrove. The rage that filled Callum was unlike anything he had ever felt. It burned in his chest like forge fire. It demanding action, demanding revenge. He wanted to march to the Hargrove ranch and confront Silas directly. He wanted to make the man pay for this sabotage. But even through his fury, Callum understood the truth. If he confronted Silas, nothing would happen. Silas would deny everything. The sheriff would see a 14-year-old orphan accusing the richest man in the county, and he would do nothing. Meanwhile, time would pass, winter would approach, and Callum would lose even more ground. Silas was counting on this. Counting on Callum's rage to distract him, to waste his energy, to make him give up. Callum would not give Silas that satisfaction. He stood up. He looked at the flooded pit, and he made a decision. He would start again. He would work twice as hard. He would not sleep until the damage was repaired. Silas Hargrove wanted him to fail. Callum Tierney would not fail. The next 3 weeks were the hardest of Callum's young life. He bailed water from the pit bucket by bucket, working through the night by lantern light. He replaced the warped shoring timbers. He relayed the stones that had been disturbed. He did everything a second time, knowing that every hour spent on repairs was an hour lost from moving forward. His body began to break down. His hands, never fully healed, cracked and bled constantly. His back seized up one morning, leaving him unable to stand straight for 2 days. He developed a cough that would not go away, deep and rattling, speaking of cold nights spent working in wet clothes. Maeve watched her brother with growing fear. She saw the hollows forming beneath his eyes, the way his clothes hung looser each week, and the tremor in his hands when he tried to eat. She brought him warm milk from Bess, forced him to drink it, pleaded with him to rest. "You are killing yourself," she said one evening, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Callum, please stop. I do not want to be alone." Callum pulled her close, feeling how small she was, how fragile. He thought about what would happen to her if he failed. The orphanage in Butte, where children worked 14-hour days in the laundry. Or worse, Silas Hargrove taking their land, their home, everything their father had built. "I will not leave you," he said. "I promise. But I have to finish this. Father trusted me to finish this. Father would not want you to die. I am not going to die. I am going to build that floor, and we are going to be warm all winter, and come spring, Silas Hargrove is going to choke on his own words." He went back to work that same night. By the middle of November, the fire chamber was finally complete. Stone walls rose 4 feet above the excavated floor, angled inward at the top to create ledges where the iron plates would rest. A feeding tunnel extended from the chamber to a covered pit outside the cabin's north wall, allowing Callum to add fuel without ever entering the house. A ventilation channel on the south side would carry smoke away from the structure entirely. Now came the hardest part: the iron plates. Callum had spent his entire life watching his father work at the forge. He had assisted with hundreds of projects, learning the temperature of iron by its color, the timing of hammer strikes, the way metal moved when it was ready to be shaped. But he had never attempted anything like what his father's designs required. 12 iron plates, each one 2 feet by 3 feet, each one perfectly flat, without warps or cracks that would allow cold to seep through. Each one heavy enough to hold heat for hours after the fire died down, and he had to forge them alone. The forge itself was a miracle of organization. Declan Tierney had kept meticulous records of his iron stock, his fuel supplies, his tools. Callum found enough scrap iron to produce the plates if he was careful. He found enough coal to keep the forge running for weeks. He found everything he needed except confidence. He started with the first plate on November 16th. The work was brutal. He had to heat the iron to welding temperature, hammer the pieces together, heat them again, hammer them flat, heat them again. He checked for imperfections, heat them again. Each plate required 3 full days of continuous work, with breaks only for eating and sleeping. And sleeping came rarely. Callum worked through the night by lantern light, afraid that if he stopped, he would not have the strength to start again. He ate standing up at the forge, shoveling food into his mouth with one hand while pumping the bellows with the other. He drank cold water and warm milk and nothing else. Maeve brought him meals and watched him work with wide, frightened eyes. She saw the sparks flying from the anvil, the glow of heated iron, the exhaustion carved into her brother's face. She did not understand the technical details of what he was doing, but she understood determination. She understood sacrifice. She understood love. On the morning of November 24th, Callum completed the 4th iron plate, 8 more to go. He was examining the finished plate for imperfections when he heard a horse approaching. He set down his hammer and walked to the forge entrance, expecting Dorothea with another basket of food. Instead, he saw Silas Hargrove dismounting in his yard. Behind Silas stood 2 other men. One was the county sheriff, a man named Putnam, who owed his position largely to Hargrove money. The other was a man Callum did not recognize, dressed in a city suit entirely inappropriate for Montana weather. Callum felt his stomach drop. "Good morning," Silas said, his smile showing too many teeth. "I hope we are not interrupting your work." "What do you want?" Silas gestured toward the man in the city suit. "This is Mr. Edmund Clayworth. Now he represents the Territorial Government's Office of Child Welfare. Mr. Clayworth, this is the boy I mentioned." Clayworth stepped forward, his eyes scanning Callum with clinical detachment. "Mr. Tierney, I have been informed that you and your sister are living here without adult supervision. Is that correct?" Callum's blood turned to ice. "We are managing fine," he said. "We have food, shelter, a source of income from the forge." "You are 14 years old," Clayworth replied. "Your sister is 8. Territorial law requires that minor children without parents be placed under the supervision of a responsible adult. Without such supervision, I am authorized to remove you both to the state home for dependent children in Helena." "You cannot do that." "I assure you, I can." Clayworth produced a document from his coat. And this is a court order authorizing the removal of minor children from unsafe living conditions. Sheriff Putnam will enforce it if necessary." Callum looked at the sheriff, who would not meet his eyes. He looked at Silas, who was still smiling that terrible smile. "You did this." Callum said to Silas. "You brought them here." "I am merely concerned for your welfare," Silas replied smoothly. "Two children alone in this wilderness, with winter coming on. It would be irresponsible not to notify the authorities." "You want our land." "I want what is best for everyone." Silas spread his hands. "Of course, if you had a legal guardian, this would all be unnecessary. Someone to take responsibility for your care." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "Someone who might require, say, a small consideration for taking on such a burden." There it was, the trap laid bare. Sign over the land or be separated from Maeve and sent to different orphanages. Callum looked at the document in Clayworth's hand. He looked at the sheriff's uncomfortable expression. He looked at Silas's triumphant smile. And then he looked past them all to where a rider was approaching at considerable speed. Dorothia Hargrove reined in her horse and dismounted before the animal had fully stopped. Her face was flushed, her hair disheveled, her breathing rapid. "Stop this," she said. "Stop this right now." Silas's smile vanished. "Dorothea, what are you doing here?" "What I should have done weeks ago." She turned to Clayworth. "Sir, I am Dorothea Hargrove, wife of Silas Hargrove. I am prepared to serve as legal guardian for these children until they reach majority age." Silence fell over the yard. Clayworth looked confused. "You wish to become their guardian?" "I do. I will ensure they receive proper supervision, education, and care. They may continue to live on their family's property, which is adjacent to my own. I will check on them daily." "Dorothea," Silas's voice was dangerous. "What do you think you are doing?" She turned to face her husband, and Callum saw something in her expression that he had not seen before. Steel. "I am doing what is right," she said. "These children have done nothing wrong. They are fighting to survive, to honor their father's memory, to keep the land that is rightfully theirs. And you," her voice trembled slightly, but she did not look away, "you have tried to destroy them at every turn. The flooded pit, this legal maneuver, all of it designed to break a 14-year-old boy. You do not know what you are saying." "I know exactly what I am saying. I know about the water, Silas. I know what you did 3 nights after the funeral. I know everything." Silas's face went pale, then red with fury. Clayworth cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hargrove, if you are willing to serve as guardian, that would satisfy the territorial requirements. I will need you to sign some documents." "I will sign whatever is necessary." The next hour passed in a blur of paperwork and signatures. Clayworth, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding before him, completed his business as quickly as possible and departed. Sheriff Putnam followed without a word, leaving Silas and Dorothea standing in the Tierney yard. Silas spoke through clenched teeth. "You have made a serious mistake." "Perhaps," Dorothea gathered her horse's reins, "but I will sleep easier tonight than I have in weeks." She looked at Callum. "Finish your floor, young man. Prove them all wrong." She rode away, leaving her husband standing alone. Silas turned to Callum. The pretense of civility was gone. What remained was pure hatred. "This is not over," he said. "Your guardian angel will not be able to protect you forever, and when she fails, I will be waiting." He mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. Callum stood in the yard, his heart pounding. He had been saved, at least temporarily. But Silas's words hung in the air like a curse. This was not over. Not by a long way. Now Dorothea risked her marriage to protect 2 orphans. Silas vowed revenge. The winter has not even started yet, and already everything hangs by a thread. Make sure you are subscribed and hit that notification bell. The real test is about to begin. November gave way to December, and the cold arrived in force. Callum worked at the forge with desperate intensity, knowing that every day brought him closer to the true test of his father's design. The iron plates accumulated slowly, each one representing days of exhausting labor. 5, 6, 7, 8. His body had adapted to the constant work. His hands, once soft with youth, had become calloused and hard. His shoulders and arms had thickened with muscle. His face had lost its boyish roundness, replaced by the angular features of someone who had aged years and months. On December 8th, the first serious snowfall arrived. It began in the afternoon, heavy flakes falling from a sky the color of old pewter. By evening, 6 inches had accumulated. By morning, the snow was knee-deep, and Callum had to dig a path from the cabin to the forge. He had 4 plates left to forge. The cold made everything harder. The forge took longer to heat. The iron cooled faster once removed from the fire. His hammer strikes had to be more precise because there was less time to work the metal before it stiffened. What had taken 3 days per plate now took 4. But he kept working. On the night of December 10th, Maeve woke to a sound that froze her blood. Bess was moaning, not the gentle lowing that the cow made when she wanted attention or food. This was something different, a sound of pain, deep and guttural, coming from the small barn where Bess spent her nights. Maeve ran outside without her coat, her bare feet burning against the frozen ground. She found Bess lying on her side, her breathing shallow and rapid, her brown eyes rolling with distress. The cow's body was trembling violently, and when Maeve pressed her hand against Bess's flank, she felt how cold the animal had become. "Callum!" she screamed. "Callum, come quick!" Her brother arrived within moments, lantern in hand. He took one look at Bess and understood immediately. The barn was too cold. The temperature had dropped faster than anyone expected, and Bess, despite her thick hide, was suffering from exposure. "We have to move her," Callum said. "Move her where? The cabin is barely big enough for us." Callum looked toward the cabin, thinking about the iron floor he had been building. Only 8 plates were installed, covering perhaps 60 square feet. But those 60 square feet were warm, heated from below by the fire chamber that never stopped burning. "Into the cabin," he said. "Onto the iron floor." Maeve stared at him. "You want to bring a cow into our house?" "I want to save her life. She has kept us alive with her milk. Now we keep her alive with our warmth." It took them an hour to coax Bess to her feet and guide her through the cabin door. The cow was weak and confused, but she trusted Maeve's voice, following the girl's gentle encouragement step by stumbling step. When Bess finally stood on the warm iron plates, she stopped trembling almost immediately. The heat radiating up from the metal seeped into her cold body, warming her from below. She lowered herself carefully to the floor and let out a long, shuddering breath. Maeve lay down beside her, pressing her body against the cow's side, sharing her own warmth as well. "People will think we are crazy," she said, "living with a cow in our house." "People already think we are crazy," Callum replied. "At least this way, we will be crazy together. And warm." By morning, Bess had recovered enough to stand and eat. By afternoon, she was producing milk again, her body temperature restored by the iron floor that Callum's father had designed and Callum's hands had built. The neighbors would indeed talk. They would shake their heads and mutter about orphans living with livestock. But Bess would survive the winter, and her milk would keep the Tierney children alive when other food grew scarce. Sometimes salvation came in unexpected forms. Sometimes it came on 4 legs. On December 14th, the temperature dropped to -15 degrees. Callum woke that morning to find frost on the inside of the cabin walls. The fire in the hearth had burned low during the night, and the cold had invaded their home with silent malice. But the iron floor remained warm beneath their feet, a constant source of comfort in the frozen world. Maeve sat on the warm metal with Bess beside her, both of them radiating contentment that seemed impossible given the circumstances. The cow had become part of their household now, her presence accepted as natural as the furniture. Callum dressed quickly, checked on his sister and their unlikely roommate, and headed to the forge. 3 plates left. Just 3 more plates. Cheater and the installation would be complete. On December 18th, Callum completed the 11th iron plate. One more plate, and he could finish the installation. He was examining the finished plate for imperfections when he heard footsteps approaching through the snow. He set down his hammer and walked to the forge entrance. Mary Whitmore stood in his yard. She was a thin woman with tired eyes, the wife of a day laborer who had settled east of town with their 4 children the previous spring. Callum had met her once at the general store, exchanging brief pleasantries. Now she stood before him wrapped in every piece of clothing she owned, her face raw from the cold. "Mr. Tierney," she said, her voice strained, "I am sorry to bother you, but I have heard about what you are building. Now on the iron floor. What about it?" "My husband went for firewood 5 days ago. He has not returned." Her voice cracked. "We are running out of fuel. My children are cold. I do not know what to do." Callum looked at this desperate woman, at the fear in her eyes, at the trembling of her hands. "Where are your children now?" "At home. I left them together, trying to keep warm. My oldest, Sarah, she is 11. She is watching the others." "How far is your cabin?" 3 miles east." Callum thought about the work still waiting at the forge. The final plate. The deadline pressing down on him like a physical weight. He thought about his promise to Maeve, about the iron floor that was so close to completion. Then he thought about 4 children freezing in a cabin 3 miles away. "Wait here," he said, and he went inside and told Maeve what was happening. Her eyes went wide with fear. "But the floor is not finished," she said. "What if something happens while you are gone? I will be back before dark. Keep the fire chamber fed. Keep Bess inside. Keep yourself warm." "Callum," he knelt and took her hands. "Those children are alone, just like we were. Their mother came to us for help. What would Father do?" Maeve was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. "He would help them." "Yes, he would." Callum, dressed in his warmest clothes, took a lantern and a length of rope, and followed Mary Whitmore into the frozen wilderness. The 3-mile journey took nearly 2 hours through knee-deep snow. By the time they reached the Whitmore cabin, Callum could barely feel his feet. What he found inside broke his heart. 4 children huddled together in the corner of a cabin that was barely warmer than the outside. The oldest, Sarah, had wrapped her siblings in every blanket and scrap of fabric she could find. She had positioned herself on the outside of the huddle, sacrificing her own warmth to protect the younger ones. The fire in the hearth had died to cold ashes. There was nothing left to burn. "Mama!" The youngest child, a boy of perhaps 3, reached toward his mother with arms that trembled from cold. Mary scooped him up, tears streaming down her face. "I am here, Thomas. I am here." Callum assessed the situation quickly. These children could not stay here. They would not survive another night without fuel, and there was no fuel to be had. Their only chance was to reach the Tierney cabin, where the iron floor could keep them warm. "We need to move them," he said. "All of them, tonight." "Move them where?" Mary asked. "My cabin. I have a heating system that uses very little fuel. It can keep them warm until this cold breaks." "Your cabin? But how?" "There is no time to explain. Can Sarah walk?" The 11-year-old looked up at him with eyes that were too old for her face. "I can walk," she said. "I can carry one of the little ones if I have to." In the end, Callum carried the 2 youngest children on a makeshift sled that he dragged through the snow. Sarah walked beside him, supporting her 5-year-old sister. Mary brought up the rear, her strength failing, but her determination unbroken. The journey back took 3 hours in the deepening darkness. When they finally reached the Tierney cabin, the sky was fully dark and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. Callum pushed through the door and felt the warmth of the iron floor wash over them like a blessing. Maeve had kept the fire chamber fed exactly as he had instructed. Bess stood in her corner, radiating animal warmth. The cabin was small and crowded with the addition of 5 more bodies, but it was warm. Mary Whitmore fell to her knees on the iron floor, pressing her palms against the metal, feeling the heat rise into her frozen hands. "It is warm," she whispered. "The floor is warm." "The iron conducts heat from the fire chamber below," Callum explained. "It spreads evenly across the entire surface. No cold spots, no frozen corners." The Whitmore children spread out across the floor, their small bodies soaking up warmth they had not felt in days. Thomas, the youngest, stopped shivering for the first time since his mother had left to find help. Sarah lay flat on her back, her eyes closed, her expression one of pure relief. "You saved them," Maeve said softly, standing beside her brother. "The floor saved them," Callum replied. "Father saved them." Callum could have focused on his own survival. Instead, he chose to help strangers. Have you ever made a sacrifice to help someone else? Share your story in the comments. And stay with us because the worst of winter is still coming. The Whitmore family could not return home. Their cabin was too far, and without firewood, it was a death trap. They would have to stay. 7 people and a cow now occupied a space designed for 4, but the iron floor did not care about crowding. It shared its heat equally with everyone who touched it. So Callum finished the 12th and final iron plate on December 19, working through the night while the cabin behind him grew more crowded. On December 20th, he completed the installation, laying the last plates across the stone ledges of the fire chamber. 12 iron plates, 96 square feet of heated floor. Enough warmth to keep everyone alive through the worst winter Montana had ever seen. Christmas Eve arrived with a temperature drop that made everything before seem mild. The thermometer outside the cabin read negative 38 degrees at sunset. The wind had died to nothing, leaving a stillness that somehow made the cold feel even more intense. The stars blazed overhead with cruel brightness, beautiful and utterly indifferent to human suffering. Inside the cabin, 7 people and 1 cow shared a space that had become impossibly warm. The iron floor maintained a steady 65 degrees. The fire chamber below required feeding only twice a day, morning and evening, consuming a fraction of the fuel that a traditional fireplace demanded. The air inside the cabin was comfortable enough that the children had shed their heavy coats and played on the warm metal surface in their cotton clothes. Maeve organized the children into groups, keeping them occupied with games and stories. Bess stood in her corner, patient and gentle, allowing the smaller children to lean against her warm sides. That evening, they gathered on the iron floor for a simple Christmas celebration. Mary Whitmore had contributed what little she had, a small bag of sugar, some dried apples, a handful of nuts. With these humble ingredients, she and Maeve created a simple Christmas pudding that filled the cabin with the smell of cinnamon and warmth. Callum told stories he remembered from his father, old Irish tales of heroes and monsters, and the triumph of good over evil. Mary sang carols in a voice that trembled with emotion. The children laughed and played and ate pudding until their bellies were round. At midnight, Maeve produced a small wrapped package and handed it to Callum. "I made this for you," she said. "Before Father died, he was teaching me leather work. I wanted to finish something." Callum unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a leather belt, simple but beautifully crafted, with a buckle made from an old iron nail that Maeve had bent and shaped into a heart. "You made this?" he asked. Maeve nodded, suddenly shy, and Callum pulled his sister into a fierce embrace. "It is perfect," he said. "I will wear it every day." "You promise?" "I promise." Later, when the children were asleep and the adults sat quietly watching the embers glow in the hearth, Mary Whitmore spoke. "You saved my family," she said to Callum. "I can never repay you. You do not owe me anything. I owe you everything." Mary's eyes glistened in the firelight. "My husband is probably dead. I came here with nothing. No food, no fuel, no hope. You took us in when you had barely enough for yourselves. You built this miracle." She gestured at the warm floor beneath them. "You have become exactly the kind of man your father was raising you to be." Callum looked at the iron plates gleaming in the dim light. He thought about his father's designs, about the months of backbreaking work, and about the promise he had made to Maeve on that rainy day in the cemetery. "My father designed this floor," he said. "I just followed his plans." "No," Mary shook her head. "Your father gave you the blueprint, but you gave these people hope. You gave them warmth. You gave them life." January 1892 arrived with a fury that would be remembered for generations. On January 4th, an Arctic front descended from Canada, pushing temperatures from -20 to -41 degrees within 18 hours. The wind returned, screaming down from the Continental Divide at 30 miles per hour, creating wind chills that could freeze exposed flesh in under 2 minutes. The valley locked down. No one traveled, no one worked. Everyone huddled in their homes, burning whatever they could find, praying for the cold to break. At the Hargrove Ranch, the main house ran its fireplaces and stoves around the clock. Despite this, the temperature in the master bedroom never climbed above 45 degrees. Silas Hargrove slept fully dressed, buried under blankets, waking every few hours to feed the bedroom stove. His cattle were dying in the fields, too many to bring inside, too exposed to the killing cold. Each morning brought reports of new losses. At the Callahan cabin 4 miles north, the family had run out of firewood on January 8th. They burned furniture first, then interior wallboards. By January 11th, they were breaking up the floorboards themselves, feeding their home piece by piece to the fire. The mother's hands were blackened with frostbite from desperate trips outside to find anything else that would burn. Across the county, the story was the same. Families were freezing, starving, dying. The wooden floors of their cabins radiated cold upward from the frozen ground below. They could heat the air near their faces with constant fires, but the floor remained frigid, stealing warmth from anyone who touched it. Only one cabin in Silverbow County remained truly warm. On the morning of January 12th, a knock came at the Tierney cabin door. Callum opened it to find a woman he did not recognize. She was wrapped in every piece of clothing she owned, her face covered with frost where her breath had frozen to her scarf. "Please," she said, "please, you have to help us. My name is Ruth Callahan. We live north of here. My children are freezing. We have nothing left to burn." Behind her, Callum could see four small figures huddled together, barely visible through the blowing snow. "Bring them inside," he said. The Callahan family entered the cabin like ghosts, too cold to speak, too exhausted to do anything but collapse onto the warm iron floor. 11 people and a cow now occupied a space meant for 4, but the iron floor did not care about crowding. It shared its heat equally with everyone who touched it. Over the next 3 days, more came. The Olson family from the south, driven from their cabin when the chimney collapsed under the weight of ice. The Huang family from town, Chinese immigrants who had been turned away from every other door because of their ancestry. Old Reverend Josiah Crane, whose church had become too cold to inhabit despite his best efforts. Callum turned no one away. By January 15th, 23 people lived in the Tierney cabin. They slept in shifts, some resting on the warm floor while others sat against the walls. They shared everything: food, blankets, body heat. The iron plates beneath them maintained their steady 65 degrees, regardless of how many bodies pressed against them. Maeve organized the children into groups, keeping them occupied with games and stories. Bess the cow, gentle and patient, allowed the children to sit against her warm sides. Her milk stretched to feed everyone, supplemented by the food stores that Callum had carefully accumulated throughout the fall. The fire chamber required more frequent feeding now, 4 times a day instead of 2. But even this increased demand consumed far less fuel than a single traditional fireplace would have needed to heat the same space. Silas Hargrove's words echoed in Callum's memory. "Your children are going to suffer terribly. Nature has a way of solving these problems." Nature was indeed solving problems, but not in the way Silas had expected. On the morning of January 16th, Silas Hargrove made a decision. He had heard rumors from his surviving ranch hands. The Tierney cabin was still standing. Not just standing, but apparently thriving. People were taking shelter there, lots of people. The orphan boy had somehow created a miracle in the middle of the worst winter anyone could remember. Silas had to see it for himself. He dressed in his warmest clothes, told Dorothia he was going to check on the cattle, and rode out into the frozen landscape. The journey to the Tierney property took an hour through snow that reached his horse's belly in places. By the time he arrived, his face was numb and his hands ached despite thick leather gloves. What he saw made him stop his horse and stare. Smoke rose from a covered pit well away from the cabin, thin and steady, but the cabin's own chimney showed nothing. No smoke at all. The windows, instead of being frosted solid like every other window in the valley, showed only light condensation at the edges, and the sounds coming from inside were not the sounds of suffering. They were the sounds of children laughing. Silas dismounted and approached the cabin door. He did not knock. He simply stood there listening, trying to understand what he was hearing. Voices, many voices, talking and laughing in a space that should have been a frozen tomb. The door opened. Callum Tierney stood in the doorway, looking at Silas with an expression that held no fear, no anger, no triumph, just calm acknowledgement. "Mr. Hargrove, Henry, would you like to come in?" Silas stepped across the threshold and felt warmth wash over him like a wave. The cabin was crowded beyond belief. People sat on every available surface. Children played on the floor. A cow stood placidly in the corner, chewing hay. And beneath them all, gleaming dully in the lamplight, were iron plates. A floor made entirely of iron, radiating warmth that Silas could feel through the soles of his boots. He walked to the center of the room and looked down. The floor was warm, not hot, not scorching, but steadily, deeply warm. He touched it with his hand, confirming what his feet had told him. Warmth everywhere, in every direction, spreading from the metal like heat from a living thing. "How?" he asked. Callum explained. The fire chamber, the stone lining, the iron plates that conducted heat across their entire surface. the feeding tunnel that allowed the fire to be maintained without entering the cabin. Everything his father had designed, everything Callum had built with his own hands. Silas listened in silence. When Callum finished, Silas looked around the crowded room. He saw the Whitmore family, who had nearly died in their inadequate cabin. He saw the Callahans, who had burned their own floor to stay warm. He saw the Huangs, who had been turned away elsewhere because of ignorance and prejudice. He saw Reverend Crane, the old man who had spoken words over so many graves. All of them were alive. All of them were warm. All of them owed their lives to a 14-year-old boy in a floor made of iron. Silas thought about the things he had done, the flooded pit, the legal maneuver with Clayworth, the constant mockery and pressure. He had tried to destroy this boy because he wanted a piece of land. He had been willing to watch children freeze because he could not accept being denied something he desired. And now here he stood, surrounded by the evidence of his own pettiness, his own cruelty, his own blindness. Something shifted in Silas Hargrove's chest. It was not a comfortable feeling. That evening, after Silas had returned home, he sat alone in his study with a glass of whiskey. The fire burned high in the hearth, but the room still felt cold. The cold of a wooden floor radiating winter up through his expensive boots. Dorothea found him there hours later, the glass still in his hand, untouched. "You went to see them," she said. "Yes. And?" Silas was quiet for a long moment. "And I was wrong," he said finally, "about everything. About the boy, about the iron floor, about what kind of man I have become." Dorothea sat down across from him. "What are you going to do?" Silas set down his glass. He looked at his wife, really looked at her, for the first time in years. "I am going to ask that boy to teach me, to show me how to build what he built, not to take it from him, to learn from him. And the land? The land stays with the Tierneys, where it belongs." Silas Hargrove, the man who tried to destroy 2 orphans, is about to do something no one expected. Have you ever watched someone completely change who they are? Share your story in the comments, and do not forget to subscribe. The ending of this story is something you will never forget. The next morning, Silas Hargrove returned to the Tierney cabin. This time, he did not come alone. Dorothea rode beside him, along with 2 of his ranch hands and a wagon loaded with supplies. Food, blankets, medicine, everything the crowded cabin might need. Callum met them in the yard, his expression guarded. Silas dismounted. For a long moment he simply stood there, looking at the boy he had tormented for months. Then slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself to one knee in the snow. 23 faces appeared at the cabin windows, watching. "I came to apologize," Silas said, "for everything, the flooded pit, the threats, the cruelty." He paused, swallowing hard. "I was so focused on what I wanted that I could not see what was right in front of me. A boy trying to save his sister, a family trying to survive." Callum said nothing. "I do not expect your forgiveness," Silas continued. "I do not deserve it. But I want you to know that I was wrong. And I want to ask if you will permit it, if you will teach me how to build what you have built, not so I can take it from you, so I can give it to others." Still Callum was silent. Then Maeve pushed through the crowd at the door and walked across the yard to stand beside her brother. She looked at Silas kneeling in the snow, at Dorothea standing behind him with tears in her eyes, at the wagon full of supplies. "Callum," she said softly, "Father always said that forgiveness is not for the person who hurt you. It is for yourself, so you can let go and move forward." Callum looked at his sister. 8 years old, wise beyond her years, the last family he had left in the world. He looked at Silas Hargrove, still kneeling, waiting. "Stand up," Callum said. Silas rose slowly, his expression uncertain. "The supplies in that wagon. Distribute them to the families sheltering here. Make sure everyone has what they need." Callum paused. "And yes, when spring comes, I will show you how to build the iron floor. I will show anyone who wants to learn." Silas extended his hand. "Thank you." Callum shook it. "Do not thank me. Thank my father. He designed all of this. I just followed his plans." "No." Dorothea stepped forward, her voice firm. "Your father gave you the blueprint, but you gave these people hope. You gave them warmth. You gave them life. She embraced Callum before he could protest, holding him like the son she had never had. The winter of 1892 finally broke in late February. The temperature rose above zero for the first time in 6 weeks, and the snow began its slow transformation from prison to memory. The families who had sheltered in the Tierney cabin returned to their own homes, carrying with them the warmth of shared survival and unbreakable bonds formed in crisis. Mary Whitmore was the last to leave. Her husband Jacob had never returned from his search for firewood. When the snow melted enough for search parties to venture out, they found his body in a ravine 4 miles from his cabin. He had slipped on ice, broken his leg, and frozen to death before he could drag himself home. Mary wept when they told her, but she did not break. She had 4 children to raise, and thanks to Callum Tierney, those children were alive to be raised. "I am staying in Silver Bow County," she told Callum. "I am not going back east. Jacob wanted us to make a life here, and that is what we are going to do." "You will need help," Callum said. "I know. Sonia, that is why I am asking if you will let Sarah work at your forge this summer. She is strong, and she is eager to learn. If you teach her, maybe someday she can help build iron floors for other families." Callum looked at Sarah Whitmore, the 11-year-old girl who had shielded her siblings with her own body during the worst night of her life. She met his gaze without flinching. "I would be honored," he said. By summer, Callum Tierney had become the most respected young man in Silver Bow County. He installed iron floor systems in 5 cabins that year, working with volunteers from the families he had saved. Silas Hargrove funded the materials for 3 of those installations, a contribution he insisted on making without any public recognition. The great cattleman who had once wanted to destroy the Tierney family now quietly supported their work, never asking for credit, never expecting praise. Reverend Josiah Crane preached a sermon in June that the entire county attended. "This winter we learned something important," he said from his pulpit. "We learned that iron does not choose to steal heat or give heat. Iron only moves heat. Point the heat upward through iron, and iron becomes the warmest thing in the house." He paused, looking out at the congregation. "The same is true of people. We do not choose to steal hope or give hope. We only move hope. Point it in the right direction, and we can warm anyone who touches our lives." He nodded toward Callum, who sat in the front pew with Maeve beside him. "A 14-year-old boy taught us that. A boy who had every reason to give up, when every reason to surrender, every reason to let the cold win. He chose to fight instead. He chose to build. He chose to save not just his own family, but every family that asked for help." The congregation rose to their feet in spontaneous applause. Callum felt his face flush with embarrassment, but Maeve squeezed his hand and whispered, "Father is watching. I know he is proud." 10 years later, spring 1902, Callum Tierney stood at the edge of his property, surveying the land that had nearly been stolen from him a decade ago. At 24, he had become the most sought-after blacksmith in Montana. His iron floor systems had spread throughout the territory and beyond, installed in homes, schools, hospitals, and public buildings. He had trained dozens of apprentices, including Sarah Whitmore, who now ran her own forge in Butte and specialized in the very technique she had first witnessed as a frightened 11-year-old. The original cabin still stood, its iron floor as effective as the day Callum had first lit the fire chamber. But it was no longer the only building on the property. A larger house had been constructed nearby for Callum and his wife, a school teacher named Elizabeth, who had come to Montana from Ohio. A separate forge building hummed with activity, where apprentices learned the secrets of heating iron and distributing warmth. Maeve, now 18, had married a young cattle rancher named David Huang, the eldest son of the Huang family, who had found shelter in the Tierney cabin during that terrible winter. Their wedding had been the largest celebration Silver Bow County had ever seen, unattended by everyone the Tierneys had saved and all the families they had helped in the years since. Bess the cow had lived to the remarkable age of 18. When she finally passed, Callum had buried her in a place of honor near the original cabin, marking the spot with an iron plaque that read, "She kept us warm when we had nothing else." Silas Hargrove had died 3 years ago, leaving a will that shocked the entire county. He had bequeathed a substantial portion of his estate to create the Tierney Hargrove Foundation, dedicated to ensuring that no family in Montana ever froze for lack of adequate heating. The foundation had already funded iron floor installations in more than 200 homes. Dorothia Hargrove served as the foundation's president. At 63, she remained as sharp and determined as ever, on channeling her late husband's transformed legacy into work that honored both the man he had become and the boy who had shown him the way. On this spring morning, Callum walked from his property to the cemetery where his father lay. The headstone was weathered now, the letters slightly faded, but well maintained. He knelt and placed his palm flat against the iron plate he had set there years ago, feeling the warmth of the sun-heated metal against his skin. "I kept my promise, Father," he said. "We all did." He stayed there for a long time, remembering the boy he had been and the man he had become, remembering the cold and the fear and the desperate hope that had driven him forward when everything seemed impossible. Finally, he stood and looked out across the valley that had been his home for his entire life. Smoke rose from chimneys in the distance, but he knew that beneath many of those homes, iron floors warmed the spaces where children played and families gathered. His father's design, carried forward by his son, spreading warmth across a landscape that had once seemed determined to freeze everything in its path. "Iron does not choose to steal heat or give heat," he said softly, repeating the words his father had taught him so long ago. "Iron only moves heat," he smiled, "and so do we." This story was inspired by the remarkable heating innovations that transformed harsh frontier winters into survivable experiences. If this story touched your heart, please like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories of courage, sacrifice, and the power of human ingenuity. And remember, no matter how cold the world gets, there is always warmth to be found in the hearts of those who refuse to give up. Thank you for watching.